Well, hello and welcome. My name is Kris Thoresen. Thank you for joining me. The passages that we're going to look at this evening are from the book of Titus, verses 11 through 14 in chapter 2. The book of Titus was written by Paul as his third and last pastoral epistle, including 1st and 2nd Timothy. This letter is written to a co-worker, Titus. It was probably written in the mid-60s. And this was written in between his first imprisonment, that's notated in Acts chapter 28, and his second imprisonment, which is undetermined in terms of the time frame in Acts. This is being the last of the pastoral epistles, and really the last letter that Paul wrote to the church. It really gives us a glimpse and really a grounding of the understanding of grace in our everyday lives, as opposed to, again, the works-based and works-centered living that was going on. Paul always juxtaposes the grace and the works throughout his epistles, and this one really applies to his co-worker, the pastor Titus, to be able to convey that gospel message as part of the everyday living the gospel life. And Paul writes this letter to the young pastor Titus, urging him to lead his people deeper into the gospel. And Paul's concern is the corrupting influence that was going on at the time with the false teachers in Crete. And they were promoting human accomplishments as opposed to God's grace. On one hand, they were plagued by a godless, free-living, do what you want to do type of life, and then on the other hand, the other dimension was legalism. So you had both of these factions going on at the same time, both based on the hope of the flesh for personal fulfillment. And what Paul reinforces to Titus is to teach sound doctrine, and that's really the basis of all the teaching of Paul, is to teach sound doctrine, and that being the gospel. And the gospel is saturated in grace. It's the gospel of grace. It's not the gospel of works or of man. And verses 11 through 14 in Titus 2 present really a concise explanation of gospel-centered living. So I'd like us to go ahead and read those chapters together and discover really the concise, detailed flushing out of living the gospel of grace and how to do it. For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions, to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age, waiting for our blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us to redeem us from all lawlessness and to purify for himself a people for his own possession who are zealous for good works. And that is not good works based upon man's own efforts. These are good works that stem from the grace of God within our lives, and living that out as a manifestation of that grace that we have in our lives. And as we read those chapters, those verses in this chapter, I'd just like to ask, what phrases stand out for you? Well, what phrases I think really stand out are self-controlled, upright and godly lives, zealous for good works. All of these are action based upon the grace and the grace-filled living in our lives. So that, again, is manifested within us, but then also lived out in our lives, in our day-to-day lives. And these are produced, according to Paul, by living out the grace of God. And Paul states that we are to live this in the present age. So as he was writing to Titus and to the people that he was pastoring, This was an age in the early church where Paul was writing this to Titus, and it was filled with its man-centered influences, as we could see what was going on at the time, where you had legalism on one end, and then you had the ungodly living on the other. But this man-centered living hasn't disappeared. It's still an influence within our time as well. So this essentially carries to our present age, and us living in our present age under the influence of man-centered living. And how do we live that gospel-centered life every day in our lives as a display of what we have in that hope of Christ within us? And this gospel produces such a longing for our great God and Savior Jesus Christ that we desire to honor him with our lives. So not only do we live that out, and in doing so we honor him in our lives. And when we do that, godly behavior will follow. The hope we have is that we are people of his own possession. I can't think of any greater statement: to be possessed, be a possession of the lordship of Jesus Christ in our lives. And as followers of Christ, we are redeemed, and by being so, that makes us zealous for the good works through God's grace in our lives. It's a great passage. It really clarifies godly living in a way that is gospel-centered and grace-based. Thank you.